What's up everybody, blessed be, my name is Mannun, and you're watching Witch in the Working, where we will be discussing all things witchy in and around, throughout and about, above, below, and beyond. So, throughout my previous videos, I've mentioned multiple times about different forms of traditions of witchcraft. I've mentioned names, for instance, from Gardnerian, Alexandrian, Georgian, Blue Star, Eclectic, British traditional witchcraft, etc., etc. In this video, I'd like to go over and introduce a few of these traditions of Wicca and or witchcraft, depending on where your broomstick lies. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome back everybody. So, Wicca today is a very popular religion with roots that trace back thousands of years. It's always been quite the controversy on when and where exactly Wicca began. Witches have been around for centuries. We know this is a fact. We also know that witches have flourished in many cultures and countries around the world and still do to this day, though they may not call themselves the term witch, but they definitely fit our definition and description of what a witch would be. We also know a group or coven of witches took Gerald Gardner under their wing and initiated him into a lineage of what they called witchcraft, a European style of witchcraft practiced for centuries, living and breathing and growing and changing with the times. They also introduced another term for this European style of witchcraft, which was labeled as Wicca. But most of the time, as Gerald states in his book, The Meaning of Witchcraft, it was simply called witchcraft by no other name. Gerald is the witch that decided to push the term Wicca in his process of reviving the old religion to the masses. And this is why many times on my previous videos, I'll mention that to a British traditional witch, like a Gardnerian or Alexandrian for instance, the two terms of witchcraft and Wicca are in fact the same thing, contrary to the statements of some of the newer practices today who insist that Wicca is not witchcraft. I disagree. Maybe your version of witchcraft isn't what you would call Wicca, but to traditionals, again, it's the same thing. Okay, regardless. Since Gardner revived witchcraft as we know it today, many traditions and practices have developed from what he taught and spread to the masses approximately 65 years ago. Many of these traditions literally spawned right off of Gardnerian craft. One of the best examples of this is Alexandrian Wicca, which is so close to Gardnerian witchcraft that in Europe these two traditions circle together amongst what would normally be forbidden oath-bound mysteries, only displayed amongst initiates of the same tradition, so to speak. Heck, there was at one time a tradition of Wicca that actually sprung up from these Gardnerian/Alexandrian mixing bowls called Algard. From there, it's a lot like a tree, with branches or roots spreading all throughout the timeline of witchcraft, with new legit families and practices popping up left and right as the seasons edged forward year after year. So many more that we're aware of, as only the more popularized systems were ultimately given the attention and space in the history books of neo-pagan Wicca/witchcraft, so to speak. So what were some of these more popular traditions of witchcraft? Who started them? Where did they come from? Are they still around? Where are they now? Let's move forward and see if we can't answer some of these questions. You, as a witch and a Wiccan, it's very important and super interesting as far as I'm concerned to know who and what some of your cousin traditions that flourish alongside of you. Especially if you ever drew interest in wanting to join a tradition of witchcraft, you should know what you're getting into. So let's start with Gardnerian Wicca, since that's what I obviously know best. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Gerald Gardner is the gentleman who revived the European and American witchcraft movement as we know it today. And this movement has gone worldwide over the decades. Gerald was initiated into a witchcraft coven back in 1939 and revived witchcraft to the masses starting in 1949 with his fictional book High Magic's Aid, and ultimately with his non-fictional book The Meaning of Witchcraft in 1954. Gerald also started his own covens, the first of which was called the Bricketwood Coven. Gerald would teach his covens what would be as close to what he was taught as he could make it without dishonoring the oaths and pledges he took when he was initiated as a witch by his mother coven, the New Forest Coven. Gerald would add a little spice to what he learned and change a few things that he knew would work, and went on to spread Wicca to everyone willing to learn the craft. Gardnerian circles are very ceremonial based compared to the more eclectic practices most see today. Gardnerian Wicca is an initiatory oath-bound tradition, which means that nothing is spoken of its practices outside of a circle. Because of the secrecy, not much is known to the public about Gardnerian practices and measures. The only way to know what Gardnerians practice and do is to in fact seek out a Gardnerian coven and be initiated into its ranks like everyone else who's decided to take this leap. There are quite a few traditions that follow this same method and opt for the so-called modern day mystery tradition method, and with good reason. Gardnerians follow a degree system, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degrees. As a young witch progresses through their training, they will progress through these degrees, possibly even up to a witch queen and magus of an area and downline. Another major trait of Gardnerian witchcraft is the fact that we all practice Skye clad, which means clad only by the sky. This in fact means we practice naked in our rites, as many witches throughout the centuries have. You can find great amounts of evidence of Skye clad practice in old carvings, paintings, and even manuscripts from witches throughout history. There are many reasons behind this practice, which I don't have time to get into right now in this video, but will definitely dedicate a video to the practice all to its own. All Gardnerians can trace their lineage back to Gardner and beyond, which gives a solid foundation to work with. Most every Wicca or witchcraft circle you read or learn about today ultimately descends from Gardnerian Wicca and has roots that lie with it. Okay. Let's move on to the next tradition, which would naturally be Alexandrian, as again, this particular lineage is directly off of Gardnerian craft, so much of the practices are quite similar. Alexandrian Wicca was founded by Alex Saunders in the 1960s, along with his wife Maxine. Alex had also self-proclaimed himself the king of the witches. As I mentioned, this tradition is mainly stemmed from Gardnerian Wicca, which Alex had learned from a student of his who had previously been part of one of Gerald's covens. Yeah, she broke her oaths, in other words. But he mixed some ceremonial magic and Kabbalah in with his system, as he had training and interest in those paths too. Two very famous authors whom are part of the Alexandrian tradition are Janet and Stuart Farrar. These two have many great books, including the Witch's Bible, which I totally recommend. Alexandrian Wicca, just like its mother Gardnerianism, is practiced today all over the world by thousands of initiates. There's a degree system in Alexandrian Wicca as well, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degree. 3rd degree initiates are called high priest or high priestesses. This too is a tradition that practices sky-clad rites. Much like Gardnerians, Alexandrians also have adapted an outer court process, which is where new potential initiates have an opportunity to circle with their group for up to a year and a day before being initiated. This, in fact, helps that dedicant to get used to his new coven, and in turn, the high priest and high priestess to know that that student isn't wackadoodle. Some priestesses, such as Vivian Crowley, would often train students in both traditions. As I mentioned earlier, these two traditions are so closely linked together that another tradition was created by Mary Nesnett called Algard, which is a mix of both. Alexandrian Wicca had a heavy influence on Blue Star and Odyssean Wicca both, which will segue me into the next tradition. Blue Star Wicca is a tradition of Wicca heavily influenced by Gardnerian and Alexandrian Wicca. It was created in 1975 by Frank Duffner out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Blue Star Wicca is practiced all over the world today. Again, this is another initiatory path which largely revolves around coven work in general. Blue Star prides themselves in doing a lot of community-based services to basically honor the gods and send a good message about all of us evil pagans. They also, interestingly enough, prefer the use of a septagram as their use of a symbol over a typical pentagram. Blue Star has a 5-degree ranking system which involves dedication, neophyte, 1st degree, 2nd degree, and 3rd degree. Along with Gardnerian and Alexandrian, Blue Star Wicca was also very influenced by the American Welsh tradition. And in fact, the Odyssean branch of Wicca is considered a sister or cousin tradition of a Blue Star. Odyssean Wicca was created in Ontario, Canada in 1979 by Tamara and Richard James. This particular tradition is mostly practiced in Canada in the United States. Odyssean Wicca too is an initiatory tradition of witchcraft, however is very different from the previous trads we just spoke about because They train their initiates to ultimately partake in public priesthood assemblies. Odyssey Wicca is strongly connected with the Wiccan Church of Canada, which is a public Wiccan church also founded by Tamara and Richard. As you may have guessed, the name of this tradition of Wicca was influenced by Homer's Odyssey. In the early days, Odyssey Wicca claimed affiliation and training with Gardnerian and Alexandrian craft, but these allegations were never proven and in fact didn't make any sense because neither of the traditions of Gardnerian or Alexandrian support public training and initiations. This particular tradition reached its apex in 1992, where that it ultimately managed 7 temples of worship. Unfortunately, for the most part, Odyssey Wicca is no longer functional and has been retired. Much like Blue Star, Odyssey Wicca has a 5-degree system: Dedicant, Neophyte, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degree. Currently, there are 2 temples, one in Toronto and the other in Connecticut. Georgian Wicca was discovered by George Patterson in 1970 in Bakersfield, California. This tradition is very similar to Gardnerian also. Patterson claimed to have received his training in Wicca from a Celtic coven in Boston, Massachusetts. Patterson had a very shady explanation to the true background of where his training came from, as he mentioned at one point he was also trained by his father, which conflicts with the Boston coven. He also claimed to have been trained by Gardnerian and/or Alexandrian witches, which there's no verification of that to this day. He claimed that he went into the service during World War II, and upon returning, his family had destroyed all of his books and tools as a witch, and he could never find the Boston Coven again. Being that most of his material derived from Alexandrian and Gardnerian practices and literature he had gathered, the system is very much like the 2 systems it copied. Georgian is not really considered a true British traditional Wiccan system though, because it cannot trace its lineage back to one of the British traditional covens that existed. Currently, there are Georgian covens that still practice all over the United States. Central Valley Wicca, or CVW for short. CVW is a tradition founded in the 1960s where it is said that a group of initiates from a Gardnerian background came over from England to California and started a coven. The original high priestess of this group is still unknown to this day, but it was said she came from England, most likely lived there, and was British. There's a lot of controversy in the tradition as to where exactly they hold their roots, but they are in fact quite similar to Gardnerian and Alexandrian practice. They hold a lot of the same structure, practices, and lore as their big brothers, and these CVWs have a close connection with the New Wiccan Church in California. Dionic Wicca is a female-centered version of witchcraft, in fact so much that the practice itself doesn't use gods in its worship and practices with only goddesses. This is very different from most forms of Wicca or witchcraft because they will use both god and goddess as a duality for and of creation. Dionic Wicca was founded by Susanna Budapest in the 1970s. Dionic Wicca is heavily influenced by the feminine and is named after the Roman goddess Diana. Dionic Wiccans will worship only goddesses and see the many goddesses as facets of the one true goddess, or the feminine supreme energy force. Much of Dionic practice comes from combinations of British traditional Wiccan traditions as well as Italian folk magic, such as that from Eridia, Gospel of the Witches by Charles Leland, and the practice stresses importance on the power of womanhood. Many Dionics will focus their energies and healings on themselves and other women as to remedy themselves from the wounds of the patriarchal society they suffer from. On the opposite end of the spectrum from Dionic Wicca is the Minoan Brotherhood. The Minoan Brotherhood was founded by Edmund Basinski around 1975 in New York City. Edmund started out as a child pursuing his passion of becoming a Catholic priest, but soon learned that his homosexuality wasn't going to mix well with the church. He went on to seek through multiple styles of witchcraft, even taking an initiation into Gardnerian witchcraft in 1973, but swiftly moving on as he didn't feel like any of these practices fulfilled his lifestyle of journey into the mysteries. Ed felt like all the many forms of craft that he journeyed to, which were quite a few, were not treating him fairly because of his homosexuality. He was frustrated that many of the traditions embraced heterosexual frameworkings within ritual and didn't really incorporate same-sex practice quite well. He began to learn that some early cults in history embraced homosexual ritual and practice, one such being the Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete. The Minoan Brotherhood was founded as a, quote, a mystery initiatory cult which erotically celebrates life through male love, end quote. Ed created a book of shadows, so to speak, called the Book of Mysteries, which incorporated ritual, which structure was largely borrowed from the Gardnerian practice and restructured to suit the wants and needs of the Brotherhood. Minoans celebrate the 8 Sabbats as most Wiccans, however, they give them a Mediterranean twist. Even though the Brotherhood is all male, unlike the Dionysics, they do embrace a goddess also, mainly the Cretan snake goddess, Rhea. Her counterpart would be her son, the Cretan bull god, making the Brotherhood duotheistic like most other witchcraft traditions. The Minoans also use a 3rd degree elevation system, and again is an oath-bound tradition. Eclectic Wicca is one of the most mainstream practices of Wicca and witchcraft today. Eclectic isn't really a tradition, so to speak, but more of a practice for the masses who choose not to incorporate with a specific tradition of Wicca. Eclectics are people who are interested in magic, Wicca, and witchcraft, and learn from books, videos like this one, and online sources, etc., etc., etc. And then they teach themselves and start practicing by themselves or find like-minded coven and practice with them. Eclectics have no roots or lineage in their practice, but on the upside, this can be very freeing and uplifting to a lot of people, especially those who are not fond of structure or stability and kind of prefer the freedom and wild chaos systems of no rules or restrictions. There are more eclectic witches in the world today than any other Wicca. Many of these are solitaire practitioners, though there are some covens too. See my info box above on a video I made about solitaires, covens, traditional, and eclectic practices, and I also have it linked down below in the description to learn more. So moving along, we come to another great tradition called Seax. This is a tradition of Wicca founded by Raymond Buckland in 1973, again in New York. Raymond Buckland is a well-known craft author who has written many books on the subject of Wicca and a major influence to a lot of beginning witches. Raymond did in fact start his witchcraft life as a Gardnerian witch over in England, but eventually moved stateside to New York, where Gerald told him, "Go, young Ray, and spread the craft to the Americas." Ray came over this way and is considered the person who introduced witchcraft to the United States and got the energy buzzing over this way. Here, Wicca continued to grow into the important and awesome religion and practice it is today, attended by hundreds of thousands around the world. Seax Wicca, unlike its cousin traditions, allows for self-initiation in its practice. It's also not an oath-bound practice like its older cousins. They elect their priest and priestesses very democratically, and the priesthood changes hands often. They mainly worship Woden, Thunor, Frigg or Freya, and Tu as their deities. To wrap up our traditions, we will move on to Stragaria witchcraft. This is an Italian-based witchcraft that was popularized in 1980 by Raven Grimassi, a very well-known Wiccan author who has many great books on this subject, and I totally recommend looking into some of them. Raven created the Eridæan tradition, which is a mix of Gardnerian practice and ideas from Charles Leyland's book Eridæa Gospel of the Witches. Since 1998, Grimassi has advocated an initiatory practice called Erissean tradition. This modern movement from Grimassi actually originated in the 1970s by Italian-American Leo Martello, who claimed to belong to a family tradition of witches, though like everyone else who makes this claim, it's never backed up with any evidence and ultimately becomes disproven or swept under the carpet. Grimassi himself makes this claim, which again is a major controversy as he could never back up his claims. Like other traditions of Wicca, Grimassi also uses the term Wicca that Gardner demonstrated. Some traits of Grimassi's traditions involve working sky-clad for at least half of the year, celebrating 8 Sabbats, working with the traditional tools of a witch, utilization of the pentagram, working with covens with an altar facing north. Pretty much the same thing that all of the other Wiccan and witchcraft practices perform, utilize, and practice in their circles. I mean, no matter where you go and what tradition you see, for the most part, you're gonna see the same structure played out again and again, just as Gardner revitalized and spread it. Okay, everybody, it looks like we're out of time once again. I hope you enjoyed this video talking about some of the more common traditions of witchcraft today. Do you work with a particular tradition? Talk about it with all of us in the comments below. Share it with us and teach us a little something new and mysterious. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, and absolutely, please, please, please subscribe to my channel and talk to your witchy friends and drag them over too, kicking and screaming to subscribe. And don't forget to ring that bell to receive future notifications of when I put out a new video. I love you guys and gals. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and staring at my ugly mug for a little bit. Without further ado, farewell.